Thank you very much, Paolo, for this very kind introduction. Indeed, I am sort of an odd speaker, I guess, in this series, being a lawyer, not a biologist, not an ecologist. I certainly know nothing about genetics. But I'll make an effort, obviously, to adjust the talk to this audience. And if I fail, there is plenty of time after the talk to ask for clarification about legal issues that perhaps were not so clear. Let me begin with a disclaimer that I recommend to anyone talking about cats in public. So for the record, I have never kicked, shot, poisoned, strangled, drowned, suffocated, or otherwise harassed or killed a cat, nor do I harbor the ambition to engage in any of these activities in the future. I'm just covering my back with this, with a view to rule 0, don't mess with cats. So cats, as was stated in the introduction, they're obviously very attractive, very cute, wonderful companion animals, and they help to keep mice from the house. But what happens when we let them go outside? That too, obviously, they can be a nuisance and a danger to people's health, but this talk is about wildlife. And cats hunt and kill wildlife, like this unfortunate gecko and this juvenile blackbird. And they basically go after anything that moves. Rodents, rabbits, shrews, bats, birds, lizards, frogs, butterflies, dragonflies, and so on. And the numbers are big. We're talking about millions and even billions. By way of visual illustration, this is a recent prize-winning photo by Jack Wanderley, who laid out some of the injured cat victims which had been brought into an American shelter, but which died anyway afterwards. So as I indicated just before the introduction by Paolo, someday my wife started asking me some difficult questions. And some of those questions she asked very appropriately in the place shown in the slide, the Forum of Athens, where long ago Socrates asked some difficult questions of his own. So she says, Arie, you're the wildlife lawyer here. You always talk about those international laws on biodiversity protection and invasive alien species. What do those rules have to say about cats? That's a dog chiming in. He's not in the cat camp. So how is it, for instance, that in the Netherlands, where we live, one alien species, the Egyptian goose, is subject to control and eradication measures. And another, much more harmful alien species, the feral cat, may not be killed. In wildlife law, are some animals really more equal than others? And how is it that I will get into legal trouble if I shoot a bird without a license, or allow one of my kids to shoot them with a catapult, or allow my dog to chase after wild animals, but that I can at the same time, with impunity, allow my cat to go around killing wildlife day in and day out? Good questions. Imagine our amazement when we found out that over a century ago, the American author of a book about cats was already asking this question. He wrote, "We now legislate to protect birds, but place no limit on the increase in activities of their most destructive enemy. A man is liable to a fine if he kills a bird, but he may with impunity keep any number of cats to kill birds." And another statement from the same Edward Forbush, a statement that you could just fast forward to 2021 without noticing it, is this: "The widespread dissemination of cats in the woods and in the open and farming country and the destruction of birds by them is a much more important matter than most people suspect and is not to be lightly put aside." Anyway, we started reading more about the issues involved and the scientific research on the impacts of cats and the legislation. And I'm saying we because I have a few co-authors to introduce here. This is Hans Somsen, Professor of European Law at Tilburg University, where I also work. This is Philippa McCormack, lecturer in law at the University of Tasmania in Australia. And this is my wife, Elvira Martinez Camacho, who started the whole project and made sure we finished it and kept us sharp all along the way with difficult questions. And the safety measures in these pictures are mostly a joke, but unfortunately not completely, as we'll see later on. A century ago, Trouwborst already documented a lot of interesting facts about the impacts of cats on wildlife. It's a really fascinating book. It's archived online for free, so I recommend you have a look. But especially in the last 15 years, scientific knowledge about these impacts has grown exponentially. The next few slides just show you the literature that we came across in our research. And all of these sources are in our published papers if you're interested in following up. In our research, we focused on all free-ranging domestic cats. So from pets through farm cats and strays to fully feral cats. That's to say, feral cats as in cats which live fully independently from people. And free-ranging cats can impact wildlife in 5 basic ways, many of which can, of course, operate in combination. The first is predation, that is simply ending other creatures' lives. The second is disturbance or fear effects, gets less attention, but for instance, one study used taxidermied cats to better understand such fear effects in blackbirds. And it turned out that even briefly confronting blackbirds with such a cat model near their nest reduced subsequent feeding of the young by 1/3, and also led to a significantly increased risk of subsequent nest predation by corvids. The third effect is competition, when cats exploit the same food, space, or shelter as wild species. Simply put, every mouse eaten by a cat can no longer be eaten by a hawk or by a marten. Fourth, a wide range of wild animals can be affected by diseases transmitted by domestic cats, such as toxoplasmosis, rabies, or feline leukemia. And fifth, domestic cats can hybridize with some wild cat species, including European wildcat. Just to illustrate the predation impact of cats, here are some estimates of numbers of animals killed by cats each year in various countries. The key thing to note is that we are talking about many millions of prey items all over the world. In the US, the annual toll among mammals and birds even runs into the billions. To put those numbers in perspective, here are the United States estimates for a range of human-related direct causes of mortality. And so if you're worried about wind turbines because they kill hundreds of thousands of birds a year, or if you're worried about the impact of power lines, which kill tens of millions of birds, then you should definitely be worried about the impact of cats. And here's the same information in a graph. And as you can see, cats kill more birds than all the other causes combined. And here's a graph showing the results of a Canadian study, which are essentially similar. And as a further illustration, here's a large-scale global study by Roland Case and others that came out just last year. And it shows that pet cats kill between 4 and 10 times more wildlife per hectare than comparable native predator species. So forget about that line that you often hear that pet cats are just playing the same role in the ecosystem that would otherwise be played by natural native predators. So what can be done to avoid all of these adverse impacts? Sterilizing cats is an option, is the key feature of so-called trap, neuter, release policies implemented in many places to address the impact of stray cat colonies. An obvious disadvantage here, of course, is that even if sterilizing a cat stops it from reproducing, it doesn't stop it from killing, disturbing, and competing with wildlife. Another option is fitting cats with bells, bibs, or other devices. However, none of these are fully effective in preventing predation and can in fact make other impacts worse. Take the beautiful color in the picture. It helps birds to spot the cat sooner, but that doesn't help nestlings and fledgling birds very much, and it only makes fear effects bigger. The third example shown here is cat-proof fencing, used especially in Australia as a last resort to protect vulnerable native wildlife in at least some areas from feral cats. This is of course expensive and unpractical at very large scales, and it still doesn't offer complete guarantees. For example, in 2012, a storm damaged part of the fence around a wildlife sanctuary in northern Australia. A few cats got in and killed about 250 bilbies. And that is a significant part of the species' world population. And bilbies are those cute little marsupials on the slide. The only thing that really works is keeping cats indoors, or at least in a cat-proof enclosure like a catio. That is to say, to keep cats under the control of their owners at all times, like every other pet. And by the way, that has the added advantage that your cat will not contract nasty diseases or be eaten by something else, be flattened by a truck, or meet another untimely end in the dangerous great outdoors. So it's about time for the question, what's law got to do with it? International wildlife law in particular. In our research, we applied the good old formula of combining relevant facts with relevant legislation, added the rules of legal interpretation to the mix, and outrolled our conclusions regarding the obligations of countries in this area. And we found dozens of international legal instruments that have something to say about domestic cats, even if they don't expressly mention them. Within those instruments, we detected three main categories of obligations: rules concerning invasive alien species, rules on area protection, and rules on native species protection. Many international agreements contain obligations to prevent and control the introduction of alien species that are invasive, that is to say, harmful to native biodiversity. These include the Global Biodiversity Convention, the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species, two instruments on migratory birds, and a series of regional agreements for Central America, Africa, and Europe. A recent story that made the news in the Netherlands can be used to illustrate what these obligations are about. An inhabitant of the town of Veenendaal, which is right next door from where I live, released 80 goldfish in a canal because he considered this an upgrade aesthetically of the surrounding shopping area. When the authorities found out, they obliged the man to fish them out of the canal again, to the last one, because goldfish are not native to the Netherlands. And let's look at an example of a legal provision here, some actual law to look at. According to the Biodiversity Convention, each contracting party shall, as far as possible and as appropriate, prevent the introduction of, control, or eradicate those alien species which threaten ecosystems, habitats, or species. Now, in the fish example, retrieving every single goldfish from that canal was apparently considered appropriate in this connection, even if, to my knowledge, goldfish have not caused the global extinction of many species, if any. How about cats then? Well, domestic cats are one of the world's very worst invasive alien species. As far as we know, cats were responsible, primarily or partly, for the global extinction of at least 63 species, 40 bird species, 21 mammals, and 2 reptile species. And currently, domestic cats threaten at least a further 367 species with extinction. 2 recent comparative global assessments both put the domestic cat in the top 3 of most harmful alien species worldwide. So in terms of Article 8 of the Biodiversity Convention, how is that for appropriate? The second set of obligations concerns the conservation of particular sites. Such obligations can be triggered when domestic cats pose a threat to any wildlife which the site in question is meant to protect. The example given here on the slide is from a European Treaty on Bat Conservation. It requires parties to identify sites of importance for bat conservation, such as roosts and breeding colonies, and to protect such sites from damage or disturbance, obviously including damage or disturbance caused by domestic cats. The third relevant category of law consists of obligations requiring the strict protection of certain species, often listed in long annexes, and typically including a prohibition to capture, kill, or disturb animals belonging to those species, subject to limited exception possibilities. All of the instruments listed on the slide apply such obligations to protected species that are vulnerable to cats. And of all of these, Article 5 of the EU Birds Directive probably has the most radical implications. With regard to all native bird species, this provision requires member states to prohibit their deliberate killing or capture by any method, the deliberate destruction of eggs, the taking of eggs, and significant deliberate disturbance. The EU Habitats Directive sets out a similar provision covering mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. The relevance of these provisions to cats obviously turns on the interpretation of the term deliberate. And in a series of rulings, the EU Court of Justice, which has the final say about the proper application and interpretation of EU law, has consistently held that for something to be deliberate in this context, no actual intent is required. It is sufficient that the actor accepted the possibility of killing, capturing, disturbing, or destroying the nest of a protected animal. For instance, according to the court, motocross racing in the habitat of the protected Cypriot grass snake equals deliberate disturbance. And so does setting up snares for unprotected foxes when there is a possibility that a protected otter could be caught. As a guidance document by the European Commission puts it, the scope of the term deliberate includes unwanted but accepted side effects. And isn't that exactly what happens when you unlock the cat flap? In performing that very act, by allowing your cat outdoor access, you accept the possibility of the capture, killing, and disturbance of birds and other protected animals, and the destruction of their eggs. And because Article 5 of the Birds Directive applies to all birds that are native to the EU, not just to rare or migratory birds, and because birds can be found throughout the territories of the member states, it is very hard to escape the conclusion that member states are required under EU law to ensure that letting cats roam free outdoors is forbidden and effectively prevented. And that is our first conclusion, reproduced here. Our second conclusion on EU law concerns unowned cats. These must be removed or controlled when they pose a threat to protected species and/or sites. And regarding international wildlife law at large, beyond EU law, we concluded that many national authorities around the world are currently required under international law to adopt and implement policies aimed at preventing, reducing, or eliminating the biodiversity impacts of free-ranging domestic cats, in particular by A, removing feral and other unowned cats from the landscape to the greatest extent possible, and B, restricting the outdoor access of owned cats. And nowhere did our legal analyses involve any rocket science. And I have to say, we were not really surprised by these conclusions. Much more remarkable is the apparent massive disregard and non-compliance when it comes to the obligations just mentioned. Wherever you look, cats continue to roam the landscape. And I don't know of a single country where cat owners are generally required under national law to keep their cats indoors, let alone a country where such a policy is effectively enforced. And to understand this, we looked to see what factors might explain and perhaps even justify this apparent non-compliance. Candidates include practical feasibility, scientific uncertainty, the interests of cats themselves and of their owners. Now, with the partial exception of feasibility, we found that these factors at best provide explanations of non-compliance, but not legally valid justifications. For instance, regarding the third one, it is not clear that roaming outside is in the cat's own best interest, but for the sake of the argument, let's suppose that it is. Then we must ask this question. When applying wildlife law, is the pleasure which a cat takes in roaming free to be accorded greater value than the lives of all the wild animals that it kills? We did not find this to be the case in any of the legal regimes we analyzed. Or even at an individual level, to focus on the picture at the top right, does the fun and excitement this cat apparently derives from hunting outweigh the fear and pain of the baby blackbird and the distress of its parents? We have not found any persuasive argument to support such an assumption, let alone an argument convincing enough to justify massive non-compliance with international wildlife law. Now, regarding the fourth factor, for someone who now owns a cat that goes outside all the time, changing that habit is problematic. That's obvious. But that's no different than a smoker who for decades was able to smoke anywhere she liked and now is no longer allowed to do so in many places. It's always about a balance between some individuals' freedoms, those of others, and the greater good. Smoking in public buildings and the workplace was banned because of increased knowledge about public health effects. Likewise, here we have the wish of individual cat owners to let their pets roam free on the one hand, and on the other, the by now very well documented great negative impact of free-ranging cats on the public good of biodiversity. And we're not even speaking about the serious public health issues around free-ranging cats. Now, it's not obvious at all that the former should prevail. And not just prevail, but again, prevail to such an obvious and significant extent that it justifies large-scale non-compliance with international wildlife law. And that basically left us with the hypothesis that the refusal of decision makers to address the free-ranging cat problem, or even to call it a problem, is motivated by fear of becoming unpopular with parts of their constituencies. And that hypothesis received a lot of support right after we published our research. So this until now was more or less a short summary of what we wrote in these two papers. The first was published in November 2019, the second in February 2020. And both appeared in respectable peer-reviewed journals published by Oxford University Press and by Wiley and the British Ecological Society. And by far the most interesting experience in the whole process has been what happened after we published this. This aftermath confirmed and taught us a lot about human nature and about the limited extent to which academics like us are able to meaningfully engage with the press, with the lay public, with politicians, and with societal stakeholders like NGOs. Ecologists and fellow lawyers have generally reacted positively to our research. For instance, one newspaper quoted another Dutch law professor as endorsing our interpretation of EU law, saying that the authorities should enforce the law against cat owners just as they have to against poachers or people driving a car through a breeding colony of birds. And another colleague at the University of St. Louis in Brussels decided to organize a moot court competition with his students, inspired by our research. We offered one newspaper an exclusive first interview, which they published the day our first paper came out. And the university also put out a press release. And then our phones started ringing and never stopped. one camera crew after another. And the item made the national news in various countries. An absolute highlight for me was that we made the cartoon in my favorite Dutch newspaper. And then, of course, people had their say in the social media. Oh boy. The day after publication, I was teaching a class and students were just imploring me not to look at Facebook and Twitter, to spare me the unfriendly things people were saying about us and about our research. Anyway, if you consider attention as such as an indicator of success, then we did pretty well. Our paper got the highest altmetric score of all law literature published in 2019, eclipsing publications about gun laws and about physical attractiveness in criminal justice. And I hinted at the subtle sting in some of the reactions we received from readers, and I would feel bad not sharing some of the raw data with you. So here are quotes from some emails I got, translated from Dutch and German. As you can see, quite a lot of insults. You followed all those expensive studies and then start whining that all cats must stay inside. Did you fall from the crib onto your head as a child? Stop your driveling about cats. This could end badly. And the third, is this what we call a professor nowadays? Someone who prefers to defend vermin? I call such people cat haters and dumstudierte unerfahrene Frischersche. Trust me, that last bit just sounds best in German. And these were some of the more eloquent reactions. Follow me now to a deeper level. I'll just give you a few seconds to read and digest these only slightly censored messages for yourselves. And also here you will find towards the end of the slide some German bonus content. I've published about wolf management and rhino horn trade and trophy hunting, and I thought those were controversial topics, but I've never seen anything like this until I wrote about cats. Next level is politics. Members of the Dutch parliament hurried to reassure worried cat owners. Take Member of Parliament Von Martels. Just hours after publication of our research, his own superior knowledge of European nature conservation law and the ecological impacts of cats provided him with the confidence to declare that our conclusions were absolute nonsense, while adding that we should not make this issue bigger than it is. And I agree on that one. It's big enough as it is. And with similar confidence, MP Weverling assured his constituency that this is, of course, complete nonsense. Europe has nothing to say about our pets. And both MPs, by the way, are from mainstream parties that were in the previous government coalition. The executive branches of the Dutch and the EU governments also reacted on the very same day. The Dutch Minister of the Environment basically pussyfooted around the issue without addressing the merits. And then the European Commission. The Commission is a strong defender of free movement rights, including of cats. That makes no legal sense, of course. So why does he say it? Other than from a knee-jerk reaction to prevent any further anti-EU sentiments from arising. You'll have noticed that the main responses we've seen so far are aggression, ridicule, and just dismissal out of hand. But where are the substantive arguments, the real dialogue? Not here. Another Dutch MP, Geert Wilders, had this to say. As far as I am concerned, all cats can go outside whenever they please, and let us securely lock up the lunatic pseudoscientists who make up this kind of nonsense. On the bright side, these two members of parliament took the issue seriously and filed various written questions. In response, however, the minister only provided a set of very evasive answers, dodging the key questions. And with some positive exceptions, the response of most NGOs, even big ones whose core business is bird conservation, was to distance themselves from our conclusions rather than embracing them. Again, I am hypothesizing for fear of antagonizing cat-owning members. But let's mention at least one of these positive exceptions amongst NGOs globally. The American Bird Conservancy has an active campaign called Cats Indoors, and its position on free-ranging cats is crystal clear and unambiguous, as it calls for all cats to be kept indoors. It opposes human behavior permitting cats to roam free, strongly opposes free-roaming cat colonies, and urges legislators to ban and eliminate such colonies, and generally to prohibit free-roaming cats by adopting laws similar to those for dogs. Exactly what you would expect from an NGO whose primary mission is bird conservation. To wrap this up, it is again appropriate to quote Edward Forbush. Questions regarding the outdoor activities of cats, he writes in 1916, are causing much dissension. The discussion has reached an acute stage over a century ago. Medical men, game protectors, and bird lovers call on legislators to enact restrictive laws. Then ardent cat lovers rouse themselves for combat. In the excitement of partisanship, many loose and ill-considered statements are made. Like old King Solomon would say, there is no new thing under the sun. And finally, there is this. It is difficult and costly to tackle most drivers of biodiversity loss, such as habitat loss, unsustainable agriculture, and climate change. By comparison, addressing the free-ranging cat problem is easy, with significant benefits to biodiversity. So this is low-hanging fruit, and it's a shame not to pick it. Thank you very much.